Hi everyone, Janelle here. I'm a functional nutritionist and doctor of natural medicine. This is my podcast where we talk about midlife wellness in the mountains. I am beyond excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Lara Briden. Lara is a best-selling author and has written some of my favorite books, including the Hormone Repair Manual and most recently, the Metabolism Repair Manual for Women. Lara is an evolutionary biologist turned naturopathic doctor and women's health advocate for the last 35 years. She joined me from her home in New Zealand. Today, we discussed how our modern world creates an evolutionary mismatch for us during perimenopause. Lara describes the phases of perimenopause and even added and explains a brand new phase in early menopause. Lara believes in the female body and wants women to trust our bodies and gives us tools to improve how we experience perimenopause. I can't wait for you to hear this one. Okay, I am so thrilled and honored to have you here. Your books, like I told you, are some of my favorites, and my copies are filled with notes. They are highlighted, they are dog-eared, they are loved, and I always recommend them in my courses and with my patients. So thank you, and thank you so much, Dr. Briden, Lara, for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Janelle. I'm looking forward to, our conversation.
Me too. Okay, so I find your approach to hormone health and metabolic health so refreshing and really unique. And I was trying to think about it and figure out why that was. And I think instead of coming at it from a medical standpoint, from diagnosing and naming and treating diseases, since you came from a biology background, I think that's what makes it really different. And to me it feels like your goal is to really understand what's going on in the body and why that is and then how we can impact it. So, first, do you think that this biology background kind of impacts your approach to hormone health?
I do think so. I think you're very clever to put your finger on that. It's only becoming more and more apparent to me now, 30 years into this or 35, that, my early training and work and published paper as an evolutionary biologist. And back then I was looking at sex differences in foraging behavior and all about female physiology. I recently had a chance to go back and read one of my papers from like 30 something years ago. And I thought, oh my goodness, yeah, I've like from the beginning just been very interested in female mammal physiology specifically and sort of normalizing that and seeing that as the normal version of human physiology and also trusting, I think, working as an ecologist, evolutionary biologist, sort of trusting in the system that the intelligence of our physiology knows what it's doing. It's evolved over, well, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ultimately to do what we need to do, and so we need to stop fighting that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And it's so funny that you say that. So I love that you were an evolutionary biologist for starters, because I think that is even, yeah, probably more of an impact about how you came from where you are and trusting the body. I mean, how important, right? Like you studied animals, nature, and
Yeah.
we trust it all. We don't question it. We don't try to, change things. And so I love that. And it made me think while you were talking about that, I've always said, okay, so I was a river guide for 10 years before I got into healthcare when I was young. And I've always said my draw to hormones is the fact that I feel like it's our hormones that connect us to the natural world. And when I was living on the river and I was my circadian rhythm, I was just like in sync with the seasons and the day. It my hormones were so happy. And yes, I was younger, of course, but it just feels like the our modern world, the more separated we get from the natural world, our hormones are the things that are talking. Our
I think you're
hormones are
right.
like, stop.
There's a term that you might know, you probably do know, called evolutionary mismatch, and this is, yes, our ancient physiology being all discombobulated and a little confused in the modern world, and you're correct in that hormones are part of that. All their signaling that they've evolved over such a long time to do are just now, yes, trying to calibrate to a world that's very different and not as, yeah, obviously not as friendly to human physiology, to female physiology.
Right. So our ancestors didn't need books about this.
No.
So what is it about our modern world? Why? I mean, I love your books. I'm obsessed with your books. Why? Like, what is it that makes it
Yeah.
so hard, do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, yes. So that's, as you probably know, I went in a deep dive into that in chapter 2 of my latest book, Metabolism, Repair for Women, looking surveying all the different ways that we're evolutionarily mismatched to our modern world, specifically our modern food supply, but not exclusively. The food supply is a big part of it. Um, so that's part of the mismatch. I don't want, we'd use up the whole podcast talking about all the ways the modern food supply is just a disaster for Homo sapiens. It's not what we're supposed to eat at all. It's like, I give the analogy of like, imagine feeding your animal, or for anyone who raises livestock, or like, imagine trying to feed them just the wrong thing. Like, their body's just not going to work. You have to try to at least somewhat approximately match physiology to the appropriate diet. Homo sapiens diet was actually quite broad. So in that sense, we have an advantage in that we're reasonably flexible in terms of the specific proportion of animal versus plant foods, for example. But the other evolutionary mismatch for humans, to some, I have to add this, is of course our female ancestors did have quite a different life history. I mean, it is true, they were pregnant or breastfeeding a lot more of the time. I think that did contribute, the change in that has contributed, made perimenopause potentially a rougher transition. I could talk about that a little bit just as an illustrative example of evolutionary mismatch. So, very likely, I mean, just from context, we would think that our 10,000 years ago or longer, we've been Homo sapiens for about 200,000 years, and there's quite a lot of evidence that we probably what menopause evolved earlier than that. So our hominid ancestors were stopping menstruating around 45 or 50 and then living for another 20 or 30 years at least. It was unusual for humans to live that long, but certainly we could do it. So I just want to totally, in passing here, debunk the idea that, menopause is now an accident of living too long. From an
Right.
evolutionary perspective, that is incorrect. Um, but our ancestors would have, yes, they were pregnant or breastfeeding a lot of the time. They might have had their last baby at around age 42, for example. So the, upper limits of fertility usually for women. And then, breastfed for a couple of years. And so no periods. They were in this low estrogen, high oxytocin state of breastfeeding, and then just cruisy from there, like maybe just never get another period, basically just cruise from low estrogen to low estrogen, losing some of their oxytocin, but possibly gaining it in other ways. Oxytocin is a really fascinating hormone that's being more researched into, what that means for menopause, how it could help even with some of the metabolic health aspects of menopause. But we're in modern day, as you know from my perimenopause book, Hormone Repair Manual, we go through this, for a lot of us, through crazy high estrogen time. Like estrogen starts, it doesn't go down in the early phases of perimenopause, it goes up, and by quite a lot, like spiking up to 3 times higher. Sometimes that's really destabilizing for the nervous system. And then, crashing down. So there's a lot more kind of estrogen withdrawal going on in our modern world than it used to be. And that's not, I mean, of course, none of that, the concept of evolutionary mismatch doesn't mean we try to go back to and exactly mimic what our ancestors were doing, because of many of us are not going to, we don't want girls to go back to having like 8 kids and, spending their whole life pregnant or breastfeeding. If they want to, fine. But that's, for a lot of women are not going to want to do that. But I think we can still take that information, that knowledge, and, therefore sort of improve our health, as much as we can, sort of make for example, perimenopause transition a bit gentler. There's lots of ways to do that.
Yeah. And I want to jump right there, but I mean, I have so many questions. I mean, it's just, I love that phrase, the mismatch, the evolutionary
Yeah.
mismatch, because it just makes
Yeah.
so much sense. And again, I think our hormones are really the first to tell us that we are in a total mismatch. So I want to touch on I love in your book how you describe the phases of perimenopause.
Yeah.
And I like you tell people, okay, you don't have to learn about them, but I do think it's so empowering to understand the phases because what you said at the beginning, we have this crazy high estrogen, so people think they're losing their minds
Yeah.
because they're like, wait, I'm supposed to be going towards menopause and I'm supposed to be going low estrogen, so why am I having all these high estrogen symptoms? So to me, I'm in the waiting zone, by the way. I'm
Oh,
almost
good.
to menopause. I
Almost to
have like
graduate.
I'm
Yeah.
almost to graduate. I'm almost to up level, as my kids say.
Yeah.
Um, but I have like by textbook gone through all of the phases that you describe
Yeah.
and that I teach in my classes. And again, it was just really validating for me to say, oh my gosh, things are getting really intense right now. I get why, and it's not going to last forever. So for
Yeah.
me, it was really empowering. Is that why you write about it so much in your book? Like, were you hoping to just show people that it's normal and that these are the phases and it's not forever? Or,
Yeah. Well, a big part of the message of Hormone or Perimanual, my perimenopause book, is that this is temporary. This is, as I say, second puberty. You're not going to be like this forever. Can you imagine? I mean, it sounds like you've raised some kids. Like, can you imagine when they're going through puberty? Like, depending on the kid, obviously, how that might have gone. But like, can you imagine thinking, well, that's how they're always going to be now for the rest of their life, is in this like transition state. The brain's recalibrating. Everything's in flux, in motion. So yes, a key takeaway from my book is this too shall pass. This is a transition, and it is possible to navigate the transition relatively gently with relatively few symptoms. I make the case. Yeah, so just in broad strokes, the phases. It sounds like your listeners probably know them. I guess if you're teaching them, they come from something the 2012 reproductive aging workshop, stages of reproductive aging. And then Professor Geraldine Pryor, the endocrinologist who helped me with my first couple of books, like she added on this phase, what she calls phase one, which is actually a very high estrogen phase. Typically, it's when progesterone luteal phases. I don't know how much your audience knows about, ovulation,
go there,
luteal
girl.
phases,
They
and
love it.
and
They're science
ovulatory. Yeah.
people.
So the onset of perimenopause is essentially defined as the beginning of the end for progesterone. Like it just, through our reproductive years, we optimize ovulation and progesterone as much as we can. That's part of fertility, but that's part of just having healthy menstrual cycles throughout our 20s and 30s, and depending on the woman, maybe into her 40s. But at some point, the corpus luteum's like the ovulations are just, yeah, they're done. They're just not gonna produce as much progesterone as they used to, and that's just a normal phase. And so that's the first phase of the ovaries just quietly, you know, reducing their activities. So that can result in the classic, high, super high. At the same time, estrogen's going high, so super high estrogen, sometimes relatively absent progesterone, and that can produce heavier, crazy heavy periods, which some women get in the first couple of phases. So that first phase of mainly just progesterone dropping away, estrogen spiking, but cycle is still somewhat regular. That's last, I think, 2 to 5 years, Professor Pryor says. It varies with the individual, and the starting age really varies too. And then the next phase is like you actually start getting some wobbling in the cycle length and time between cycles. And then in phase three, you can start to get really, have big gaps between periods.
And
And
that's when
that
I think
lasts
that people have the most symptoms, right? And that
potentially. Yeah.
often
Yeah. Because you do go then legitimately into a low estrogen phase while you're not cycling or attempting to ovulate, and then suddenly, but then you do ovulate or start moving towards another ovulation, and your estrogen just goes 0 to 60. Like it can spike up really high, and that can be, and then crashes down again. And that can be destabilizing. And then, as you say, the waiting room or phase four is the just waiting to see, was that my final period? Was that my final period? I've had like a 9 month gap, and then you get another period. And I know, and it can be a bit longer than 12 months, to be fair. Like the periods, depending on the woman, can kind of sputter out over those final few years. And then I would actually add, I didn't put this in the book, but there's kind of a fifth phase as well, which I just, now that I'm 3 or 4 years past what am I? 3.5 years past my graduating to menopause, past my 1 year after my final period. And I'd heard about this, but now I can say there is a stabilization. I think this is how long it takes for the recalibration to really all happen, the hormone receptors to recalibrate. You do like you start to stabilize once you're, at least 1 year past your final period, but then 3 or 4 years later, it's like, "Oh, okay, right." Like I just really start to feel quite different. I'm in my groove now. And I think that would be true for women who are not on hormone therapy, or even to some extent for women who are on a lower dose hormone therapy. You still like your receptors still just kind of get their legs, if you will, like sort of, see that, okay, this is our new way of doing things. And so that hopefully will give women hope that, by the time they're 3 or 4 years past their final period, that's when the zest begins, the menopausal zest. There's a quote early in Hormone Repair Manual from some Australian researchers where they found a recurring phrase among, approximately 60-year-old women was that they felt life is pretty fantastic. So, that's coming.
I love that. Yeah. And I'm really getting into that whole spiritual aspect of things too now, like the rebirth and like the new spring, the new summer, post menopause and all that. I'm really loving all that. Okay.
Yeah.
So I also love your idea of, or the using the word recalibrate, not the
Yeah.
idea because your body does recalibrate.
Yeah.
So can you just talk about that a little bit? Like what recalibrates?
Yeah, like getting down a bit more into the nuts and bolts, like what's actually happening. Well, lots of things are happening. I mean, I think all parts of the body, the immune system, the nervous system are recalibrating to the new lower levels of estradiol. Primarily, they have to recalibrate to unless you're supplementing it to like a very low, no ovarian progesterone, although the nervous system can make its own progesterone and the brain makes its own progesterone, which is great. But they're like, okay, this is, we're doing things differently now. And that is, that can take a few years, I think. And then, but the other aspects of recalibration are also just straight out the number and sensitivity of hormone receptors. So our hormone, I don't use the word balance, but like our hormone, situation is not just the level we happen to have in serum or something like that. Like there's every cell has its a lot of, number of hormone receptors and sensitivity of those receptors. And it's constantly like, even just on an hourly basis, changing those and how sensitive they are. And so that's part of the recalibration is it's finding its right level of all of that. And also the other aspect of recalibration is when it comes to estradiol in particular, our main estrogen, cells make it. They always did. I mean, every cell in the body makes its own estradiol. They do as we do as children. Men make estradiol in all their cells. We do even during our reproductive years when the ovaries are also making a huge amount. And then after menopause, we make it. So the body's sort of calibrating how much estradiol should I be making. And yeah. And of course, that recalibration, as I explain in the book, can be um, impaired by different aspects. I mean, if we've got something going on with our health, like chronic inflammation or insulin resistance or gut problems, insulin resistance is a good example because it will make it quite difficult for metabolism to recalibrate the way it's supposed to um, after losing extreme metabolic advantage that estradiol gives us. So young women are sheltered to a large extent from insulin resistance compared to men. Of course, it is still possible to develop insulin resistance as a young woman, but it's less common. So, and then of course that change, and that's the metabolic change of perimenopause. That's why a lot of women are seeking help. It's not just because of the weight gain around the middle that causes, but also a lot of some of the neurological symptoms can be from just this drop in brain energy because the brain is not able to like sort of dip into a ketones the way it would like to actually in this new low estrogen state.
I mean, I just wish I had you all day because there's so many things I wanted to ask you about what you just
Yeah,
said that I think are so important for women to understand and empowering to understand because they can help them feel better.
yeah,
So let's see. First, I want to say I know you started your whole naturopathic career because you loved women's hormones, but you've recently turned to metabolic health. And
yeah,
so you kind of touched on this a little bit there,
yeah,
but can you just go into that a little bit
yeah,
deeper because I find this all the time also. It's such a big player with symptoms in perimenopause. So why did you go to, metabolism from hormones? Like what's the
yeah.
connection? Or briefly, of what
Yeah.
are a few
Yeah.
connections?
That's a great question. And I think just quite simply, I think it's because metabolic health is hormonal. It's a hormonal condition. So I think like part of it's that it's like, follow the thread. And also to be fair, I was very focused on insulin resistance as a clinician for at least 20 years. So, and I was measuring fasting insulin and, straight up, metabolic health, insulin sensitivity, whether someone has insulin resistance or not. I'm putting different terms out there, hoping people kind of resonate with one of those. Is hugely important for polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, of which I treat a lot, which affects at least 1 in 10 women, probably more. And it's also very important for perimenopause because we do get this just natural shift to insulin resistance with perimenopause, which not wouldn't have been a problem for our ancient ancestors, but in the modern food environment is a problem. I'd say perimenopausal metabolic problems is just the classic example of evolutionary mismatch. We were never supposed to be doing this transition in this kind of food environment.
And can we pause for just a second? Do
Yeah,
you think that's primarily because of fiber and processed foods?
I think
Like lack of fiber,
as
I
a,
mean?
yeah, I think so. As I mentioned in chapter 2 of metabolism repair for women, I go through all the different potentially aspects of our modern environment that have created this metabolic mess that a lot of people find themselves in through no fault of their own. Some of it's environmental toxins or endocrine disrupting chemicals. About one expert estimated that about 15% of metabolic dysfunction is directly from environmental toxins. And that might not even be toxins that the person themselves is currently exposed to, but toxins their parents or grandparents were exposed to in terms of something called epigenetic, this passing on of genes that have been switched on and off by different exposures, not just toxins, but food. And also there's some very weird things with the modern food supply. It's not just the yeah, the lack of fiber for sure. That gets a tick, that gets a mention in the book, but it's the okay, so it's multiple things, but I think it's probably two big things as a primary and then like a bunch of other ones. So ultra refined starches do something very weird. It's partly the lack of fiber, it's partly that they're acellular. So the cell walls have been removed from the ultra refining. And just that's doing something weird in the gut. Like the satiety hormones, like particularly famous IGF-1, not kicking in when ultra refined starch comes through. It's like the gut, or the whole hormonal system in the gut that's supposed to be registering food and being like, oh, great, like we've had some food. It's not seeing that. There's something about ultra processed food. It's just not even noticing it going in. Then those same ultra refined starches are creating small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or leading to intestinal permeability and it just truly quite massive amount of inflammation coming from the gut. Some of that could be from emulsifiers and ultra processed food. And the other big player in ultra processed food, I don't know what your audience, I always try to test the water before I mention this, but high dose linoleic acid or polyunsaturated fatty acid or omega 6.
Mhm.
Essentially, this is the seed oil controversy. One paper I read recently said that at the moment in the States, anyway, I think it was 90% of people's fatty acid intake is linoleic acid. And linoleic acid was never supposed to be, it was supposed to be like a tiny percentage of our diet. It's an essential nutrient, but it was never supposed to be 90%. And that is doing weird things to the mitochondria, to a whole part of the nervous system called the endocannabinoid system. It's potentially making people hungrier than normal. It's doing weird things to the ovaries. I don't, through my biologist lens, I'm like, controversy aside, and sure, some people are saying crazy things about seed oils, but there's something very weird about linoleic acid in the doses that it's in, and that is part of the problem. So forget what your question
Mhm.
was. Yeah, about ultra processed food and our evolutionary mismatch with that.
I know. I forgot what my question was too. I'm like, just keep
Yeah, sorry.
talking, Lara. Like
Yeah,
everything is so
yeah,
great that you say. No,
yeah.
it's true. We were talking about like why you originally or not originally, but why you've recently wrote your book about
Right.
metabolism and how it
Yeah.
relates to and like everything you're saying, it's so important for women because they come with these issues like I have hot flashes, I have weight gain, I have headaches, I have, all of these perimenopause, anxiety, sleep problems, symptoms. And then I'm always saying, okay, well, let's go back to your microbiome and let's go back
and your
to your
gut.
stress and let's go back to all of these things. Like we didn't even talk about stress with metabolism, right? I mean, there's a big
Sure.
mismatch evolutionary too. Our world is so stressful all the
Yeah.
time. And all of this just goes together so well. And the closer they get to the end of perimenopause, when things are going more erratic, they're like, why are you talking to me about my microbiome? And what you're
Yeah.
speaking into is just how it really is all connected and
Yeah.
it all matters and our hormones are impacted by all of it. Our food you mentioned, the toxins.
Yeah. I mean, what a good starting place for people might be to just think, just to kind of go back to what I was saying, that menopause has been around for hundreds of thousands of years anyway. Some of our, one of our pre Homo sapiens ancestors evolved it. And so, it was never meant to be symptomatic. So modern day forager people like the Hadza in Tanzania go through menopause. They know that periods stop at 40, 45, or 50. They report zero symptoms with that. That's not considered to be a problem. That's, in general, most traditional cultures kind of think it's quite a good thing, actually. You get to like move to that next phase of doing other stuff. Um, the fact that symptoms are arising out of that evolutionary mismatch, which we've been talking about, I hope, kind of shines a light on. Therefore, we need to, as best we can, try to realign some of those aspects of our health and trust that will support the body through what is supposed to be a symptomless transition. And I think there is definitely something I've observed, that sort of the more distressing a symptom is, the more, and it makes sense, right? I guess humans, then people think, well, it must need a very strong intervention. If it's a strong symptom, then it must need something prescription only to like combat that. But in my almost 30 years experience with patients, symptoms, including perimenopausal symptoms, can respond very well to some of these, like fixing the gut, the example you gave. And I will also just at this point say it's not an either or situation. I mean, I'm generally actually supportive of hormone therapy for perimenopause and menopause. I think for women who need it, for women who benefit from it. So it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. Like I think women could definitely bring, especially progesterone. I talk a lot in the book, and even at some point bring estrogen therapy online and get some of its benefits, but also be doing the other things that are, through my lens, often doing as much, if not more, than I see the hormones as like a little adjunct. They can help a bit, but the big support will come from some of the other things, like moving the body. So one thing, in the life phase of menopause or postmenopause, this pretty consistent with women I've talked to, and I'm curious to hear what your patients or people you interact with, is this just need to get outside. Like there's much more. I certainly found that for myself. I always loved being outside, outdoors, but with the transition to menopause, it's just like, okay, I just need to spend more time outside. And that's, I think, the brain knows what it needs.
Well, I think that goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. Like our hormones connect us to the natural world. I truly believe it. And I think
Hmm.
when we have this big shift in hormones, we have a calling to realign with what's best for us and we can ignore it or we can learn about it,
Hmm.
which you help us do. I'm trying to help people do. And then what you were saying, like the really good news is there is a lot we can do to
Yeah.
improve how we feel. And the earlier we start, the better
Yeah.
in working on these things. And I'm with you 100%. I recommend people explore hormone therapy when appropriate and when they want to. But I still don't think it's a substitute for doing the work because we still have to receive those hormones, process those hormones, excrete, and so I think I've seen it really help people get through some of the bumpy times and
Yep.
help with some symptoms. But I do still think because all of the things that help to improve our perimenopause experience help us in every other way, right? Like growing older, our best,
Yeah.
help our brain, help our heart, and all that. So We don't have very much longer, Lara. So, can you please share? I mean, your books are amazing. I will keep recommending them to everybody. They are loaded with tips and tricks. Before we sign off, can
Okay.
you just, what's one thing? I mean, I know there's a million things because you've written so many books, but what's one thing that you just want to spread far and wide, scream from the top of the mountain for women in perimenopause to really understand?
Well, that's what we said right at the outset. This is symptoms are temporary. The neurological symptoms are temporary. This too will pass, acknowledging there are some longer term, like vaginal dryness and things. There's different aspects to it. But in general, the kind of crazy feeling is will be temporary. And there's a way through it. And yeah, you are not broken. Our body's meant to do this. We evolved to do this. Trust your body is a message from all of my books. And that, as you so astutely identified right at the beginning, that trust idea to trust your body comes straight out of my work as a biologist because the female physiology knows what it's doing. But, it's got its own wisdom.
I think that is such a great message. Thank you so much for sharing it. Thank you so much for joining me. I loved our time together. It went too fast. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Briden.
Thanks.
That's it for this week. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a comment and a review as that helps it reach more people. You can find me and the courses I teach, the Midlife Hormone Club and the Energy Club, online at Mountain Rebalance. I help midlife women understand their body and age better. If that sounds like you, please join my newsletter. And if there's a topic you'd like me to cover here or an expert you want me to have on, let me know. In the meantime, keep playing, and here's to aging our best.